By morning, the bed was empty. No struggle, no blood, just cold sheets and a name that would never be spoken again. The guards didn't ask questions. The nurses didn't whisper. The corridor swallowed the absence like it had been expected. And the last person to see him alive was the doctor. But why her? The order arrived without ceremony, folded thin and final. It wasn't addressed to the camp. It was addressed to her. What it demanded didn't align with medicine and it didn't resemble care, yet refusal was never mentioned. She was told this was necessary, temporary, contained. Others were relieved when the responsibility narrowed to one pair of hands. She understood what was being asked long before it was explained, because silence had already been chosen for her. And once she stepped forward, the camp's rules no longer applied in the same way. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It settled. It pressed down in layers disguised as routine. She walked the same corridors, counted the same steps, washed her hands the same way, yet every movement felt observed, measured, waiting to be corrected. Conversations ended when she entered a room, not abruptly, gently, as if silence had been rehearsed. No one accused her of anything, which was worse. Accusations could be answered. This could not. At night, the hospital refused to sleep. Pipes clicked. Footsteps echoed where no one appeared. She lay awake replaying moments she had already lived, searching for a version where she chose differently, but every path ended at the same place. The order was never repeated, yet it existed everywhere. In the way guards lingered too long. In the way patients avoided her eyes. In the way her name stopped appearing on informal lists, replaced by nothing at all. She told herself she was still a doctor. That intent mattered. That compliance could coexist with conscience if she stayed precise, controlled, humane. But the logic fractured under repetition. Each day required a quieter version of herself, fewer questions, shorter pauses. She began to notice how easy it was to stop reacting, how relief followed numbness. That realization frightened her more than the order ever had. The isolation was deliberate but invisible. She wasn't confined, punished, or threatened. She was simply left alone with responsibility no one else would share. When something felt wrong, there was no one to confirm it. When something felt normal, she no longer trusted that either. The camp hadn't asked her to break rules. It had asked her to carry them privately, silently, until they no longer felt like rules at all. By the time she understood what was happening to her, it was already working. The conflict wasn't between obedience and defiance anymore. It was between who she had been before the order and who the silence was slowly shaping her into. Nothing announced the change. That was the most unsettling part. The hospital still woke at the same hour. Boots struck the floor at the same intervals. The bell rang when it was supposed to. But the rhythm had lost its certainty, like a clock that still ticks while time quietly slips. The doctor noticed it first in the smallest places. A tray left outside a door instead of carried in. A guard standing half a step farther back than usual. A patient answering questions correctly but too quickly, as if rehearsed. No single detail demanded attention. Together, they formed a pressure that refused to name itself. She said nothing. That restraint became instinctive, observing without recording, nodding without reacting. She understood without being told that acknowledgement itself carried risk. Patterns only existed as long as they were unspoken. Once named, they demanded response, and response was exactly what the system was avoiding. The routines began to bend. Rounds took longer, though no new cases appeared. Some patients requested reassignment, then withdrew the request before it reached paper. Others stopped requesting anything at all. Their symptoms remained unchanged, but their posture shifted, shoulders tight, hands folded, eyes fixed on corners of the room rather than faces. She learned to read these signs the way she once read charts. Guards stopped interrupting her work, not out of trust, out of distance. When she passed them in the corridor, they nodded without expression, the way one acknowledges machinery rather than people. It wasn't hostility. It was separation. She was no longer part of the shared structure. She was something that moved alongside it. A chair appeared outside one examination room. It had never been there before. No one sat in it. No one removed it. It simply remained, angled slightly away from the wall, as if left mid-decision. She passed it 3 times before realizing it had not existed the day before. The 4th time, she adjusted her route to avoid it. She told herself this was nothing. But the camp had always thrived on predictability. Every rule, every punishment, every mercy functioned because it could be anticipated. What unsettled her now was not danger. It was uncertainty without escalation. The environment was testing new shapes, seeing which would be tolerated. And she was tolerating them. During one examination, she paused longer than necessary before removing her gloves. The patient watched her closely, eyes moving between her hands and her face. When she finally spoke, he flinched, not at her words but at the sound of her voice itself, as if voices were no longer expected in that room. Afterward, she stood alone at the sink, water running, hands submerged long after they were clean. She listened for footsteps. None came. Silence had begun to behave differently, no longer an absence but a condition. The pattern breaks multiplied. Meal deliveries arrived earlier, then later, then returned to schedule without explanation. Paperwork circulated incomplete, signatures missing, dates skipped, stamps misaligned. Once she received a form already approved for a procedure she had not yet proposed. She corrected nothing. She performed nothing. She returned it unsigned, placing it back where she'd found it. No one followed up. That was when she understood the shift had reached a critical point. The system was moving ahead of action. Decisions were being prepared in advance of cause, as if outcomes mattered more than processes. The camp was rehearsing consequences. She began to feel time differently. Minutes stretched inside rooms, then collapsed between them. A full morning disappeared without memory. An hour-long task felt instant. She stopped trusting her internal markers and relied instead on external cues, bells, shadows, sounds, but even those began to slip. One afternoon, she realized she had not spoken her own name aloud in days. Not because it was forbidden, because it was unnecessary. That night she dreamed of the hospital exactly as it was, unchanged, intact. Operational, except every door opened inward without resistance. No locks, no hinges, just doors that yielded the moment they were touched. She woke with the sensation that something irreversible had already happened, even if no one had yet acknowledged it. And the chair outside the examination room was gone. Replaced by nothing. That absence lingered longer than the object ever had. The first consequence arrived without a beginning. She noticed it in the records room, a space so tightly controlled that even dust felt regulated. One folder sat slightly apart from the others, its spine facing the wrong direction. She turned it instinctively, expecting resistance, a correction, a signal that something was out of place. Nothing happened. Inside, the pages were complete, clean, orderly, except the final entry, which described an outcome without documenting any preceding event. No date of admission. No initial condition. Only resolution. She closed the folder slowly, aware that the room felt different now, smaller, as if it had learned something. From that moment on, effects began to surface ahead of causes. A patient was transferred before requesting it. A bed was prepared for someone who had not yet arrived. Supplies ran low for procedures she had not been asked to perform. The camp was no longer reacting. It was anticipating or pretending to. She did not ask questions. That restraint, once protective, now felt participatory. But participation no longer required action. It required endurance. Patients began behaving as though they had already accepted something she had not been told. Some thanked her at the end of examinations that had offered no treatment. Others avoided gratitude altogether, their relief expressed only in the speed with which they left the room. A few lingered, as if waiting for permission to say something else, then decided against it. The accumulation was quiet. No single moment justified alarm. That was the brilliance of it. Each irregularity diluted the next. Confusion became ambient. By the time she felt disoriented, the environment felt settled. She realized she was being trained. Not instructed, conditioned. Time fractured further. She began misjudging how long procedures took, how many patients she had seen, whether she had eaten. When she checked the clock, it offered no reassurance. The hands moved correctly. The problem was not timekeeping. It was experience. One afternoon, a patient failed to appear for an appointment that had been confirmed twice. His bed was stripped before nightfall. No explanation followed. The space he'd occupied became neutral again, indistinguishable from any other. She tried to remember his face and found she could only recall fragments. A cough. A habit of folding his blanket too tightly. Nothing complete. Memory, she understood, was being edited in real time. The hospital itself began to feel less like a place and more like a process. Rooms no longer held meaning. They were stages for transitions that left no trace. She passed through them without imprinting, careful not to linger, careful not to notice too much. Awareness had become a liability. And yet certain details repeated. A faint metallic smell in one corridor, always at the same hour. A light left on in an unused room. Footsteps stopping just short of the threshold when she worked late. These were never explained. They didn't escalate. They simply persisted, inviting interpretation while denying confirmation. The unanswered became heavier than any revelation could have been. She stopped writing personal notes. Not because she feared discovery, but because she feared clarity. Once something was articulated, it demanded moral placement. Silence allowed flexibility. Silence allowed survival. One evening, she realized that she had begun to anticipate outcomes herself, adjusting her actions based on effects she had not yet witnessed. She prepared for reactions before stimuli. She adapted to a logic that no longer required evidence. That frightened her, but not enough to stop. The system had achieved its most efficient state, shared uncertainty. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone behaved as if they did. Responsibility dispersed, guilt thinned, meaning dissolved. When she finally noticed a name missing from the daily roster, not crossed out, not removed, simply absent, she felt no shock. Only recognition. This was the new order. Not chaos, not collapse, but accumulation without attribution. And somewhere inside that structure, she was no longer certain whether she was witnessing the process or reinforcing it. The detail returned. It was small enough to ignore the first time, easy to rationalize, a sound not loud, not sudden, arriving at the same point every evening. A dull, rhythmic contact spaced too evenly to be accidental. It didn't echo. It didn't travel. It existed only where it occurred, as if the walls themselves absorbed it. She never traced its source. That restraint became part of the pattern. Each night as the hospital settled into its artificial quiet, the sound appeared again. Not closer, not louder, identical, perfectly repeated, the kind of consistency that erases coincidence. She noted the time once, then stopped. The moment she began waiting for it, she understood the trap. Anticipation replaced curiosity. During the day, the repetition manifested differently. A patient who asked the same incomplete question during 3 separate visits, never finishing the sentence. A door that resisted only on the first attempt, then opened freely. A guard who paused at the same spot in the corridor, every shift, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. None of it escalated. That was the lock. If danger had increased, action would have been justified. If clarity had emerged, resistance would have been possible. But repetition without progression created paralysis. The mind searches for pattern completion and finds only loops. She began adjusting her behavior around these loops. She scheduled tasks to avoid the corridor at the hour of the sound. She ended consultations early to prevent unfinished questions. She learned which doors to open slowly, which to leave untouched. These adaptations felt minor, rational, harmless. They were none of those things. They were concessions. The hospital no longer needed enforcement. Compliance had become internal. The rules no longer had to be spoken because they were now anticipated. She understood then that the order she'd received months earlier had not been the real directive. It had been the introduction. The true mechanism was this: conditioning through unresolved repetition. One evening she failed to hear the sound. The absence struck harder than its presence ever had. She stopped walking, listened, waited. When nothing came, unease flooded in, raw, directionless. Relief would have meant escape. Instead, she felt disoriented, unmoored. The next night the sound returned. Identical. She did not feel relief. She felt alignment. That was when she recognized the final shift. The system had not broken her will. It had synchronized it. Her sense of normal now matched the environment's demands. The unanswered no longer provoked anxiety. It produced stability. She wondered briefly whether anyone else noticed the sound. She never asked. Questions implied divergence. Divergence implied risk. And risk was no longer measured in punishment. It was measured in dissonance. To fall out of rhythm now would be to stand alone. So she remained in step. The chair never returned. The names never reappeared. The records remained complete and wrong. And the most unsettling realization settled in with quiet precision. If the rules had collapsed, it was not because they were violated. It was because they were no longer needed. Nothing happened when it should have. That was the first unmistakable consequence: the absence of reaction. No arrests, no reprimands, no closed-door meetings or raised voices. The system did not correct itself because it no longer recognized deviation. What had once felt like a fragile imbalance now settled into permanence, as if the camp had finally chosen its shape. The changes revealed themselves slowly, the way damage does when it is meant to last. Records became immaculate, too immaculate, pages aligned, ink consistent, dates precise. And yet entire sequences of time were missing, stitched together so cleanly that only someone who had lived inside them could sense the gap. Outcomes remained. Processes vanished. The archive no longer documented events, it documented conclusions. When she searched for familiar names, she found none, not crossed out, not amended, simply never entered. It was not destruction, it was replacement. The hospital continued to function, but its purpose had shifted. Care became procedural rather than human. Patients were processed efficiently, quietly, with minimal interaction. Conversations shortened. Questions narrowed. Even pain was expressed differently, less urgently, as though everyone had learned the futility of emphasis. She noticed that new arrivals adapted faster than the old ones ever had. They absorbed the atmosphere immediately, sensing what could and could not be acknowledged. No one explained the rules to them. They learned through omission, through what wasn't asked, through what wasn't answered. Survivors, those who remained long enough to be called that, avoided specific words, not out of fear but out of habit. Language itself had been streamlined, precision removed. The less one said, the safer the sentence felt. The truth had not been outlawed, it had been made impractical. Once she attempted to reconstruct a timeline from memory, not to expose anything, only to reassure herself that it had all happened in some coherent order. The effort failed. Events refused to arrange themselves. Causes slipped away from effects. Days overlapped. Faces blurred. She understood then that erasure did not require forgetting. It required fragmentation. The hospital itself bore the marks of this transformation. Rooms felt subtly altered, not rearranged, but redefined. Spaces that once invited pause now encouraged movement. Lingering felt inappropriate, even dangerous, though no rule forbade it. The building no longer held memory. It facilitated flow. And she flowed with it. Her role had been reduced without announcement. She was still consulted, still addressed with formal respect, but no longer included in decisions that shaped outcomes. Authority had detached from accountability. She remained visible but no longer central, a symbol rather than an agent. That realization arrived without bitterness. Acceptance had dulled the edge of resistance. One afternoon, she discovered that a procedure room she had used countless times no longer appeared on the floor plan. The door existed. The equipment remained. But officially, the space had ceased to exist. She stood there longer than necessary, hand on the handle, aware that acknowledging the discrepancy would require explanation. She let go. The most enduring consequence was not fear, it was normalization. The camp did not feel oppressive anymore. It felt settled. The tension that had once filled the air dissipated, replaced by a calm that carried no relief. This was not peace. It was equilibrium achieved through subtraction. By the time she recognized what had been erased, it was no longer something that could be restored. Because erasure, once complete, leaves no outline. Only function. Only silence. Only a system that continues, untouched by guilt, insulated from memory, and entirely uninterested in whether it was ever meant to be this way. Long after the hospital had settled into its final rhythm, she stopped asking herself when it had all gone wrong. The question no longer made sense. There had been no single moment to point to, no fracture loud enough to mark an end or a beginning. What had happened did not arrive as violence. It arrived as permission. The camp still followed rules. They were posted, repeated, enforced, but they no longer carried meaning. Meaning required judgment, and judgment required choice. Those had been quietly redistributed until no one could say who held them anymore. The structure remained intact, yet hollow, a machine running on habit rather than intent. She thought often about the order that had started everything. Not what it demanded, but how easily it had been absorbed. How little resistance it had needed. Obedience, she realized, was rarely forced. More often it was offered, exchanged for stability, for belonging, for the comfort of not standing alone. The most unsettling part was not what she had done. It was how normal it had felt to continue. When she looked back, she did not see herself as a villain or even as a victim. She saw someone who adapted, someone who learned the boundaries of silence and stayed within them. Someone who understood that survival did not always require cruelty, only compliance. That realization offered no relief. Because if the system had collapsed, it had done so without chaos, without rebellion, without anyone raising their voice. The rules hadn't been broken. They had been made unnecessary. And that truth extended beyond the camp, beyond the war, beyond any single place or time. It lingered as a question that refused to stay contained. How often do systems endure not because they are just, but because those inside them learn how to live with what they no longer question? The hospital still stood. The records remained complete. The silence held. And somewhere in that silence lived the answer no one wanted to speak aloud. When obedience feels ordinary, who is left to notice when the rules disappear?